My guest again today is Dave Collum. And Dave, what do you have for us here today?
Well, I gave a talk to my class on climate change. And as I noted to them, once in a while I burst something out in class that's contrary. And I often say to them, look, I don't expect you to believe me. I'm a credentialed expert and you should doubt them. But the reason I shoot these things out without warning is so that you might, next time you're reading an article that is against what you think, you might slow down a little bit. And I'd shot out a few climate change statements and stuff like that. And so I gave an optional lecture. And it was interesting. I said, look, it's on a Friday. We don't have class that Friday. I know some of you may have planned to go away, so I'm sorry you're going to miss it, which gave them the excuse not to go if they wanted. And I said it was totally optional, nothing to do with the course. I'm just using the lecture room. And then I gave this, I said, you can bring a friend if you want. I don't care. And the classroom was probably 2 to 3 times as many people as the class itself. So a lot of people showed up with no advertising from me. I got yelled at by the chair. He said, I thought you were going to stick to chemistry, because I've had a few complaints when I throw out these, Tourette's-like outbursts. And I explained to him what I just said to you, and he didn't respond. So I presume that was a satisfactory answer to him. So in any case, I gave a talk that I've been working on over the years that I gave it to an investment conference, for example. I've modified it for length and stuff like that. What I'd like to do today, because people said, "Oh, please, did you tape it? It's on YouTube, blah blah blah." And you noticed that, and that's why you suggested maybe I do it here. Since your listening audience is so obviously sophisticated on the topic, the idea that someone like, who knows, Tony Heller drops in or whatever, to tell him stuff, it's kind of, the experts are on the receiving end of this talk. And so I've thought about how to present it. And what I think I'll do is present it in a slightly modified way, where I go through the talk, but there's going to be a tone of, and this is what I said to them, flavor, so that it's half talk and half explanation of the talk. The slides are all the same, and maybe even provide a little sort of, this is why I presented this way, that sort of motivation. What you'll notice in the talk is there's no references. I decided to leave them off because some of them were pretty big, and they clutter slides. And so I said, look, if anyone ever wants the reference to one of these, I can provide it. But, I pulled a bunch really valuable. I want to give a plug to Thomas Kurz's book that's coming out in 6 months. I think it could be the best book on climate change written to date. I don't know. What would you say is about Thomas Kurz's aside? What's the best climate change book?
That is a great question. I mean, it depends on the audience and stuff. I like actually Mark Morano's Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change as more of an introductory book. It makes no sense to total normies. But Javier Vinos has some really good ones that are for people who are heavily into it. But there's so many of them. Joe Bastardi, there's tens of them. There's so many of them.
Right. And I read 1 or 2 of them. And then after a while, you kind of get the plot. So I move along. I have other things I have to obsess over. But Kurz's, I think, does a really good job of bringing the hardcore referencing, hardcore data without, and to the point where I don't see how you get to the end of it without saying, holy shit, I just didn't understand how bad it was. That's my opinion. It's not really, I don't think it's necessarily the right book for a person who's new to the idea, but someone who's predisposed to believe that climate change might be yet another big pile of crap. I've come to the conclusion that everything that comes through mass media is a pile of crap. So, you could name a keyword and I could tell you what's a pile of crap about that subject. So I think anything they say on TV, likely you should assume they're lying and go from there. So again, as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the flavor of the talk as I go with a slightly different tone to you guys than I gave to the class. So I start out earlier this year. I did a debate with Steve Keen, who's an economist, and it was a zero hedge debate. And I was asked to be the denier, and he was the supporter of the climate narrative. And it was an interesting debate. I didn't really win it. I let him talk, and he kind of lost it, in my opinion. I just patiently, he said enough things that I thought were ridiculous. And at the very end, I sort of jumped in and showed a bunch of slides, and I think it was game over. You may recall that to prepare for it, I tried to figure out Steve's style. That was more important to me than the content. I thought I could beat him on content. So I spent a couple hours with you on Zoom, and I spent about 6 hours with Thomas Kurz at dinner, and just talking about how to think about going in a debate against a guy with a British accent. So in any event, it went really well. Bill Fleckenstein was the host. So in any event, I start out with this slide. I find this to be a bit of a scammy slide from the denier's point of view, because it starts out with Crichton's famous quote about consensus science, not science. It's politics. But you do get to change your mind. And so just because in 77 they thought it was an ice age, and in 06 they thought it was climate change, that I don't have a problem with that. Who will stop Earth from burning, of course, is the rantings of a moron. So with that, you can see that the opinion changed, as we know. Got to have some Greta Thunberg crap in it. And here's Greta. And what I emphasize to the class is that normally I don't put as much writing on a slide as you will see on this. And part of the reason is because they're quotes which will be paraphrased by me from prominent scientists. And it's important to pay attention to who these people are, because of the claim that no one with a half a brain would ever deny the narrative. And so I point out that there are people with well over a half a brain denying the narrative. And so here's St. Greta, as they call her, saying that in 5 years we're humped, and that was in 18. Greta is now, by the way, taken over. Her attempt to fund her carbon footprint is now focused on Israel and Gaza. So she's moved on to something else that she's hoping is more profitable. I don't think it's going to work, actually. So here's John Kerry, climate czar, who I would pay good money to debate, because I actually think he's a moron. As I said to the class, the drinking game will be, you have to take a shot every time I say moron or retard. And then I said something to the effect that I can say retard now that Trump has been elected. So here's John Kerry mentioning that that to get the 1.5 degrees is just money. John Kerry is really an idiot, in my opinion. John Kerry knows far less about climate change than either of us, in my opinion, and he just flies around the world and doesn't know what he's doing. You'll notice, you've seen this picture also, these are all the famous people who supposedly care about climate change, and there's not a solar panel in sight, so they obviously are hypocritical. And then again, here's Otmar Edenhofer, IPCC, which I remind them is the Bible of the climate change narrative, saying that it's really not about climate per se, but it's about the redistribution of the world's wealth, speaking in 2010. So he admitted what was one of the more truthful things is that the climate change story is really about money. And the narrative has several chapters to it. One is climate change. The other is resource depletion, pollution, overpopulation, and the $150 trillion opportunity. So no, I'm a resource depletion hawk. So I think that the finite sphere and infinite growth are incompatible. So there's that. I have no problem with the pollution concerns, although The event horizon, the Gulf of Mexico, showed us that the Earth regenerates pretty effectively, even when, it really did look like the gates of hell had opened up in the Gulf of Mexico when that happened, and it healed. And so, but I think pollution's a legitimate concern. And overpopulation, I'm not a eugenicist, but there's a big obsession now with the world population shrinking. And they're talking about it being catastrophic. And I didn't point out to the class, but I point out to more sophisticated crowds that that anytime you need new entrants to a game to pay for the existing entrants, which is the argument that gets made, that's a Ponzi scheme. And so the fact that we supposedly need to keep breeding to pay for the existing people, or the system will collapse, that it's a classic Ponzi scheme. And maybe we should let the population shrink organically, and a lot of potential problems would be solved. Then the $150 trillion opportunity is a quote from Goldman Sachs, and it gets back to the idea that they smell money, and they see all sorts of ways that they'll get rich if the climate narrative is perpetuated. And so moving on, there's a bit of a historical record here. I have emails in which I was getting pestered by several people, including my brother and a guy named David Walker, who's a doctor, saying, how do you know climate change is real? And I had great faith in the scientific community to both get at the truth and correct errors. And because I lived in that world, and I did not see the politics as clearly as maybe I should have. But this is actually a verbatim email that I sent to my brother saying, look, I had dinner with the Secretary of Energy on Saturday night, and he said there are no credible scientists who doubt global warming. And then I emphasized by saying none, right? I mean, this is clear. It's a definitive, no credible scientist statement. I like to point out the picture of the Earth there that really looks like it's about to light my screen on fire. That I warned the class that anytime you want to make a graphic, you want to emphasize that you make it bright red, because that looks like it's hot. But I could have made that green. I could have made it any color I wanted. So you should be aware of the fact that the color is being used to deceive you. And you get famous quotes from famous whack jobs like Marcia McNutt, editor of Science, saying that the time for debate has ended. The science is settled, which I'm sure is what inspired Steve Koonen's title. Even if political opinion is not settled, Marcia McNutt obviously knows nothing about science. When you say the science is settled, you've pretty much neutered your argument right there on the spot. Then a classic one, 97% of climate scientists think climate change is a crisis. This is the core of the narrative, right? Well, I've had conversations with people who've made the transition from either being agnostic or believers to disbelievers. And I think the big lie that you can basically negate within a couple hours, like I was sitting with Konstantin Kaysen, and if the listeners have not seen Konstantin Kaysen's talk at the Oxford Union on climate change, it is the most brilliant climate change talk I've ever heard. You should shut down this and go find it. And I said, Konstantin, how long did it take you once you decided to dig to figure out that the climate change story was crap? And he said, a couple hours. And that was my experience. It took a couple hours before all of a sudden the whole story started smelling. As you know, the 97% narrative came from a survey of something like 1,500 papers, which they read the abstract, which is okay. They called out all the papers that said nothing, which turned out to be almost all of them. They were left with 79 papers, of which 77 said it was a crisis. And you go, that's not a survey. That's not valid. That's crap. Now, what I point out to the class is that if someone quotes that and they are a climate scientist, they're either profoundly ignorant or they are liars. And it is if they know where that number came from, they are liars when they use that statistic. They are flat out bald-faced, bare-faced, bold-faced lying to you. And that really is the problem you face in the climate change narrative, is that the pro narrative crowd, it seems to be willing to bend and break the truth. to serve their needs. By the way, I'd like to point out to you, Tom, or even a listener who can get my email, give it to them. If there's something wrong here, if I use a plot that's really just bullshit, or if you have a better plot, right? You have something better, something you think I missed, I should have shown, send me an email, because this is a living document a little bit.
I do have, Dave, I have a little nugget I'd like to throw in here about the consensus.
Interrupt.
Well, it's fascinating. There's a guy named Joe Duarte who's been writing about the consensus, and he says, there is a welding paper in the 97% consensus. I kid you not. It's a paper by Volvo engineers and suppliers about challenges for body shops welding the new high-strength steels. They mention climate change because of the idea that reducing weight with stronger steels will reduce emissions or something. So he says there's tons of papers like that written by people. You think they're going to be expert climate scientists? This is written by welding people, and that's part of the consensus. That's how crazy it is.
That's like, I was listening to a podcast the other day about the pension crisis that's coming. And the guy who analyzes pensions in trouble, he says, I've seen state pensions that invested in Beanie Babies, right? To give you, there's some, the internet really opened the gates of hell for us. We really have dove in head first. So, but if someone has something to add, if you have something, please interrupt, because I'm not really giving the talk. I'm talking about the talk. So interrupt. Again, send me an email. I'm at dbc6@cornell.edu. If you want to send me a graphic, anything, have a ball. We've all seen this picture that Will Happer, who I once asked you, who's your favorite? You said Will Happer. You really adore Will, apparently, and he's elite physical scientist. He was advisor to many presidents, and you can see his credentials right there. And he basically says CO2 will be a great benefit if we can get enough of it. And that we're actually in a fairly depleted mode. We're in CO2 starvation. And Will talks about the nonlinearity of response to CO2 and everything. And the activists don't like them; they dismiss them. But here's the trees growing at different CO2 levels, and greenhouses, again, as your crowd knows, they put them up to 1,500 ppms of CO2 to grow the plants. They do it artificially to get the plants to grow better, which means if you're working in a greenhouse, you could probably suffocate. There's Richard Lindzen again, a quote from him saying it's the biggest illusion in history. MIT geophysicist, very smart guy, old white guy. People love to dismiss him, but he knows what he's talking about. Again, one of those apparently non-credible scientists saying it's a mess. And then the sarcasm starts kicking in. Any idiot can see that the days are getting hotter. And I show a plot, which you couldn't possibly conclude the days are getting hotter from this plot. But this only goes back to 1990, I think I see there. But it does pose a problem if the oceans are about to boil. That's not a path that gets you to boiling oceans. And here's famous ocean expert Mototaka Nakamura of Hawaii, saying that the data before 1980 are not trustworthy. The temperature data, little paradoxical, because I'll show a lot of data going all the way back to 800,000 years ago. So I'm not. I think he's referring specifically to data measured of a certain kind. So that quote's a little out of context, in my opinion. But again, it's a warning that you should be leery of data in this field too. And you can see there that the CO2 concentration appears to correlate with temperature back 400,000 years. And then I proceed to point out to the unsuspecting audience that there turns out to be a statistical offset of those two plots that you can't see visually, but if you actually do a detailed analysis, it turns out there's an 800-year offset, and that and there's a lag, and that the CO2 concentration lags the temperature by 800 years, which means the ocean is warming, and then the CO2 is being released. And that's freshman chemistry, because as you warm something, it degasses and gives off CO2. So that makes total sense. Actually, 800 years seems pretty quick to me, actually. So the correlation, the apparent correlation, turns out to completely obliterate the case. One time I saw Thomas Sowell, who's globally famous thinker and economist. He said, until you can explain this one, that you don't have a case. He focused on this particular piece of data. Moving on, maybe if you look at 100 years of recorded highs, this is just all the credible measurements on a single date in February over 100 years. There is no trend, and if you want to see a trend, it goes the wrong direction. There's so many of these plots. One of the frustrating things I find when I'm talking about this stuff is that the climate change community has managed to jigger with every imaginable data set and corrupt it. And so you can go out there and find this plot now rearranged, and it always gets steeper and warmer, and they never correct it in the other direction. The error is always, it was too warm back in the olden days, and then now we have it right this time. But this one's 2021, so I like the headlines. There's a lot of headlines in this talk. Vintners in France haven't seen this kind of weather since the 14th century, during a time called the Black Death, which is supposed to scare us, right? And what I like to point out is that you could change that headline and say that it was this goddamn hot 600 years ago, right? And you and I both know, and your listeners know, that that's what's called the medieval warming period, which we also know that due to ClimateGate and all sorts of stuff, that they've worked very hard to try to find a way to make the medieval warming period go away through all sorts of data manipulation tricks and stuff like that. And so, in any event, every time when you look at a chart like this, it appears everything's just kind of normal looking, and we're in a somewhat warm period coming right out of the Little Ice Age. Here's Patrick Frank, physicist at Stanford. I believe he's at the synchrotron at Stanford, and he's a statistician, and he basically says that you can't possibly tease out a signal from the data. I think he was the one who said that the error bar on the estimated temperatures were 5 times the size of the reading itself. And so it was a rather ridiculous thing. And he basically said, I'm not a climate scientist, but I know statistics, and this is stupid. Here's a picture of what the models predicted, what actually supposedly happened. Again, that's a little bit of a ruse of a plot, in the sense that it does show that they can't predict shit. But I'm okay with scientists continuing to fail to predict shit. The problem I have is when it gets turned into definitive crisis narrative. That's the problem I have. So scientists are allowed to blow things repeatedly. Again, IPCC report, they had said it's a coupled nonlinear system, and anyone who knows modeling knows that means you're toast. It's not going to work because coupled nonlinear systems are so mathematically complicated. It's a physicist, it's like a 3-body problem. If you have 2 particles, you can calculate various things, orientations. As soon as you get 3, you have a mess on your hands. And so it's not, you can't predict it. And then that little statement somehow got purged, supposedly, from the 2001 report, presumably because it was awkward. I'm not sure. And a reminder to your readers, the IPCC report seems to be carved into 2 pieces. I find it insufferable to read. I've tried, and it's just so dry. But the 2 parts are the scientific part, and I think the scientific part's not bad. And then you've got the political part, and that's where they take data that shows nothing and turns it into a crisis, right? That's where all the headlines get pulled from. And here's Steve Koonin again, not lacking in a strong resume. I think he's the provost I think this slide might be provost. He was a physicist at Caltech. a great modeler. I think he was the provost at NYU, but he's Obama's chief science advisor. So he's not like, some Trump guy in case people don't want to trust him. He wrote the book Unsettled, and Steve basically says that that the conclusions have gotten ridiculous and demonstrably false at this point. Here's the president of the American Association of State Climatologists and co-author of the IPCC report saying that the models are all parameterized. Translate that, it becomes fudged. And we force the models to include human influence, and you can do that. I can make anything go from the lower left to the upper right. You give me any data set, and I can find a function that will go from the lower left to the upper right. And here's various functions, not of which they're not very important, but here, for example, is the IPCC alarmist scientist projecting to the future. That is a stunningly simple function to the point. I look at a lot of plots for a living, and that is AX to the B power, where B looks to be about 2.0. So somehow they've taken something as complicated as global sea level rise and turned it into a 2-parameter equation, best I can tell, which is, let us just say, too simple. Now, we're talking before this. You released recently on Twitter, and you should probably post at the bottom of this thing when you post it online, the ClimateGate emails. And as we talked about, I thought they were I thought there were a couple of bad ones, and apparently there truly are countless bad emails where various scientists are talking to each other and admitting that everything's just total horseshit. So here, for example, is one of Michael Mann's co-authors on his hockey stick, which is what Al Gore used to win the Nobel Prize, and it turned out to be just total horseshit. And here's his co-author saying that it's such crap. He says, "Excuse me while I puke." So he obviously can't stand what Michael Mann did. As a reminder, just the other day, Michael Mann lost in court. Did you see that?
I did.
He lost in court to Mark Stein, where he had sued Stein for calling him a bullshit artist, and Michael Mann just got told by the judge to pay Stein $500,000. And what pissed off the judge is Michael Mann lied in court. And so Michael Mann has truth issues, and he is at the heart of ClimateGate, and the hockey stick is at the heart of ClimateGate. It's by far one of the most popular plots, and people still show it even though they know they fabricated it. And then here's another person, a professor of physics at Oxford. Admittedly, Oxford's a safety school in Europe. But he says, "You expect me to denounce the hockey stick as dribble?" Yes, I should. And then there's another one of climate scientist Edinburgh saying, did Mann get it all wrong? Yes, Mann got it all wrong, right? So again, apparently these are not credible scientists, because 97% of credible scientists agree with Michael Mann. You'll see here, Michael Mann blocked me. I've been blocked not only by every major climate scientist, even though I've never once communicated directly with him, except for Hayho or whatever her name is. But I think that exchange with Hayho got me put on a list. I'm sure you're blocked by all of them too. But I'm also blocked by all the vaccine guys, by Hotez and Peter Daszak and Barrick and these guys. So I'm blocked by the two big bundles of liars. Science has a serious problem on their hands, because now there are two very, very large scientific issues in which the scientists totally dropped the ball. One is COVID, and the other is climate change. And we got to get our credibility back. And the way you do it is you call out the charlatans. And I've told many colleagues who I think are good scientists who get money out of this, I said, look, if you don't call out the charlatans, you are going to be the baby thrown out with the bathwater, and it's going to be your own fault. So when they mow through and say this field's not worth funding, and you're funded by it, but you do good science, you can blame yourself for refusing to clean up the field when you could. And then I love these headlines. There's so much controversy outside the community. It's harmful because the whole community loses credibility. That was about the acidification story, which turned out about a year or two ago got overturned, and they said, the ocean's not really acidifying after all, and they're worried about their credibility. And at which point I say, in an ocean metaphor, that ship has sailed. And then here's a great Mail headline saying that their world top climate scientists told to cover up the fact that the Earth's temperature hasn't risen for the last 15 years. So this, again, is cover-ups and scandals because there's really just too much money and politics at stake here. So everyone's told to lie, and they do. There's John Clauser, 2022 winner, the Nobel Prize in Physics, saying that it's total crap. He says it with such sneering laughter when he talks about it, right? He doesn't just say it. He laughs about it. He jokes about how they can't handle clouds and how it's one of the multi-trillion-dollar mistakes being made in science. And so yeah, again, Nobel Prize in Physics in 2022, and he started spouting off about it. And I think it was the IMF he was supposed to speak at, maybe the BIS, one of the financial type institutions. And he started spouting off about climate change being a joke and how they couldn't even handle clouds. And they canceled his talk, right? Because we can't have someone talking about something that's inconvenient. So the censorship, you show me someone being censored, I'll show you someone who's telling the truth, right? That's the bottom line. Climate activist here, he's just another old white physicist. And at that point to the class, I turned to the class, I said, this is what's so toxic about woke. And I said that, quote unquote. And I said, it gets you to stop thinking. So they just write him off as an old white physicist. That's how you explain why the 2022 Nobel Prize winner in physics is not right. He's an old white physicist. And Jimmy Dore, comedian, smarter than the climate narrative guys by pointing out that you have to lie. You don't have a very good point. Again, back to sarcasm. Any idiot can see hurricanes are getting more frequent. If you see a plot that you've never seen before, yell to me, because I bet you've seen every one of them. And of course, you look at the plot. If there's a trend there, you know, it gets past me. And if I had to guess, I'd say it's slightly downward just looking at it. But I wouldn't want to bet my life on it. That's for sure. These are global major hurricane frequencies. Now, that's only 40 years. Maybe in that 40 years, they're not more frequent, but they're more severe. And here's some data. Again, the source of this data is good. I don't have a reference. Again, you can provide it. Thomas Kurz can provide it. It's out there. This is severity, and obviously, if there's a trend, it's going the wrong way. So the severity is out there, and this all been known for a very long time, right? Who is the guy? What's the name of the guy who Pilko?
Roger Pilkey Jr. Is it him?
Pilkey Jr. Yeah. He said, look, there's no evidence of any change over the last 100 years. I mean, he was very clear on that. That made him very popular, of course. Or maybe you got to pan back further, go back to 1900. There's continental U.S. hurricanes making landfall. The reason landfall is restricted is because in 1900, we didn't know how to detect hurricanes in the middle of the ocean. So landfall is where you could go back and say, oh, look, the headline showed that it whomped, Tampa back in 1907 or whatever. And as I think I got this plot from, at least was talked about by Clauser, and he said, flip the plot, horizontally, rotate it. It wouldn't look the same. There's really nothing there. And he says, they go, maybe tornadoes are a problem. No, the tornadoes are not showing an increase in violence. I guess this one's the number of hurricanes. So the number is dropping off, not going up over the last half century. More than half century. So we're right now at the lowest in history, and we can detect them better. So lowest in history is pretty weird. It's a funny one. Or maybe U.S. heat waves are picking up. No. Now, Now, I confess that I don't know what the annual heat wave index is. It's too vague a title, but it's clear that there's no trend, whatever it is. And you can also see in the 1930s, as you know, which was the warmest period in the U.S. This century, this last 150 years, you can see that, you know, the thing that helped create the Dust Bowl, which also was bad land management, stuff like that. But you can't see any, you know, anything, the earth catching on fire in the later part of the century. And everything looks pretty normal besides that one decade, which, have you ever seen an explanation for why the 30s were so bad? I can't confess to knowing.
I don't know why they were, but I do know that they're telling us heat waves are worse since 1959 or so. If you look and pick a nice low point on that graph and say since then.
Yeah. That's
it.
Yeah. So for those watching, you know, right here, you can find a slope if you start right here, right? The selection of starting points is one of the big criminal chart crimes committed by this community. We'll get to that in a second. Or maybe look at droughts globally, right? Maybe the U.S. is too narrow. Maybe, you know, ocean currents change and therefore the U.S. is, so here are the global droughts. And, you know, it's conceivable. You take a bunch of real smart guys, you might tease something out of that data, but it sure doesn't look like the Earth's catching on fire as a consequence of more CO2 being put in the atmosphere. Or maybe look at global disasters, right? This goes back to 2000. They don't exist either. There's no trend there. Rising sea levels and flooding. Well, it turns out the top plot, you could kind of pretend like there's rising sea level, even though it really looks like it's wobbling. The bottom plot shows the Atlantic oscillation, and it really looks to me like what we're doing is we're coming out of this phase here in the Atlantic oscillation, going into, you know, and the Atlantic conveyor, which strikes me as a potential consequential phenomenon, where if that conveyor, that big current ever stops, I'm told that's the origin of ice ages, when that Atlantic, is that theory still holding up in your opinion?
I don't know if it's true, but yeah, it might be. I find it interesting that they have scare stories that it's going to be too cold in England if global warming causes that conveyor to shut down. Then it's going to be too cold. Watch out. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense actually to me, because that does move a lot of water around the oceans. Yeah. And so that could be the explanation for why ice ages are rhythmic. One of the interesting things is that modern man has evolved their civilizations between two ice ages, the one that preceded us and the one that is somewhere in our future. And if we don't figure out this whole energy story, we don't figure out how to deal with it, when the next ice age comes, it's going to get real cold. And when we come out of it, there's not going to be fossil fuels to rebuild civilization. And so we really have this little window to get our act together, to get through the next ice age successfully. And it's not obvious to me it's not obvious to me we should care either, because I'm not sure we do that much good on the planet, but it won't be in our lifetime. So, you know, who cares?
There is that whole scare story. I'm sorry. The whole scare story. If it gets a little warmer in London, they're going to get kidney stones.
I'll get to the kidney stones. Okay. I'll get to the kidney stones. Okay. They're coming. There's the other scare story, the magnetic poles moving around. And that the gamma rays coming from the sun. And I've not known what to do with that story. There's a guy named something Sun Weatherman, you know, Sun Weatherman.
Ben Davidson. Yeah.
Ben Davidson, right. There's also a language problem. One is the poles reversing, and I think that's rare, but I think there's just poles adjusting, and that's what Davidson's talking about every 6,000 years. To the extent that's real, that could be a problem, because 6,000 years is not a big window. And he's predicting that poles are moving quickly. He says the poles are moving quickly and are going to alter the weather considerably. So as anyone who's actually paying attention to this story knows, that the heat that we are worried about here comes from the sun, and that the the sun is unbelievably rhythmic, and I must confess that it's so rhythmic that it astonishes me. I don't know what the rhythm is. The physicists do. The solar physicists can predict where we're going. It's almost like predicting night and day at this point. That those oscillations are stunningly rhythmic. And there's some real minima where you freeze your ass off. Look at that 1799. That's kind of the little ice age down there. I believe they're predicting we're about to freeze our asses off again. So that'll be the ultimate irony. But, you know, all those extinction event characters who walk around in funny red suits, they're going to be long gone, and we're not going to be able to get our pound of flesh out of them. So they're the ones who are busy gluing themselves to the sidewalk, or, you know, the guys who sit in the highways during rush hour. I call them biodegradable speed bumps. And so the solar guys seem seriously uninspired by the climate narrative. There's a plot that, again, a famous plot. I don't know its source, but there is a kind of a hint there. It shows that over time, the solar activity correlates with temperature activity pretty successfully. Again, Nir Shaviv graduated from college, and when he was 18, solar physicist, chairman, Hebrew University, said that basically it's all the sun. CO2 has no demonstrable causation whatsoever. He publishes an op-ed, and I think it was Forbes, and it was taken down within something like 4 hours because of the uproar of the damage that would do to the narrative. And so you are not allowed to go against the narrative. I'll tell you what has changed markedly is it when, and this is both good news and bad news, it has become now a political football. So 10 years ago, when you first started doing this, the deniers were very rare, and the narrative was controlling the whole flow. And then it became a political football where it became the conservative said it's bullshit, and the liberal said it's a crisis. And the bad news is it means every nitwit on the planet now has an opinion. But the good news is now there are two teams to debate it, and there weren't before. And so I think with it being a political football, I think there are other now motivations to fight this battle. And so I'm okay with that, even though it's going to make it chaotic. Here's a picture of the Holocene temperatures correlating with cosmic rays, which again, it's all about the sun. You got that bazillion ball of fusion up in the sky, and somehow that gets ignored. It turns out at one point the IPCC didn't have a single solar physicist in it, is my understanding. And somehow leaving out solar physicists strikes me as a bit of an omission when you're talking about the temperature of the Earth. And so there is good data. Now, I'm not qualified to evaluate the quality of this data. So cosmic rays, and they use all sorts of weird isotope studies. This could be total crap too, for all I know. I'm not a physicist, but it's out there, and someone has to wrestle with it. Again, here's more correlations of sea level rise. And this data is a little rougher in the correlation, but if you spend a little time staring at it, you can see that the red and the blue curves really do go up and down together to a reasonable extent. So the sea level seems to go up when the sun activity goes up, and vice versa. I did an experiment with Grok. I asked Grok, which I think might be the best AI. Do you use Grok?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Some other folks have told me as they've compared them that Grok is the best, but I don't know.
Right. I think so too. And what you got to do is ask Grok the right questions. You can ask him stupid questions and get stupid answers, but that's always true. So I said to Grok, I said, name 20 famous scientists, prominent scientists who believe climate change is not a crisis. This was a control experiment. And it named 20. And I probably knew the names of 18 of the 20, right? All the obvious names. And a couple more that I'm not sure I know much about that guy. But it even gave statements that the guy made and stuff. So Grok did a good job of naming the top top 20 or 20 prominent deniers. And then I turned the question around a little. I said, Grok, provide names of 10 solar physicists who believe climate change is a serious problem. And Grok came back and said a whole bunch of shit, but the money shot was there are no direct names or quotes from solar physicists explicitly stating climate change is a serious problem. Now, you may recall last time we chatted together, I asked you, do you know any solar physicists who buy the narrative? And you said no. But I was bothered by the fact, I said, yeah, but doesn't mean Tom hasn't overlooked them. And that's what inspired me to do this experiment. Well, apparently Grok is overlooking them too. Grok can't find them. And so I found that, and I used that against Steve Keen in the debate. Steve, at the very end, I should add, I think out of frustration, made the declaration that he thinks that civilization will be gone by 2050. At which point I'm thinking, oh, why don't you just, why don't you just shoot yourself right in the head or foot or something? Because that prediction is not going to age well. Even if he's right about solar warming, that's not going to age well. So here's Willie Soon, who used to be at Harvard, but apparently he's now at a private institute. And I think it was to get away from the need to fund from conventional sources. I think, the usual NSF, DOE stuff wasn't the best way to go. And he's also a colorful character. So I think if you watch Willie, he's very flamboyant. He's funny. But you kind of get more sense of gravitas out of a Koonin than out of a Soon, right? But Willie is a smart solar physicist, and he's been saying this is all bullshit for a very long time. And he also points out here that all the major events in history, rise of kingdoms came when it was warm, not cold. This is by far one of the most iconic pair of photos in the climate change community, where they say, look, any idiot can see the glaciers are receding. And this particular glacier, I think this one's in Greenland probably, you can see it's receding. But what was revealed, there was two things. One is there were artifacts of indigenous people, which meant they were either living on the glacier or there was no glacier from about 1,200 years ago. Most importantly, underneath the receded glacier are 1,200-year-old trees, which meant they grew there 1,200 years ago, which means that glacier is not very old, and it must have receded previously as well. And so the glacier obviously is a living, breathing thing. And of course, that's what glaciers do. They recede and then go back out, and they oscillate around. It probably has to do with ocean currents and stuff like that. Again, when glaciers recede, civilization emerges. There's a graphic that kind of shows it. Too much noise in this. This is not a great graphic. I'd like a better one for this, but I think this glacier is in the Alps, yeah, and it just shows it coming and going back and forth. First prediction that the ice will be gone that I know of was from a pioneering naturalist in 1814. He said that soon the Arctic ice would be gone. I don't hold that against him. He was working, this is like 50 years before Darwin. So this guy really was working with limited available data. And then a plot of global sea ice over time, going back to 1979. Maybe it's changing, but the naked eye can't see it. And one of the things I emphasized to the class repeatedly was that even if global warming is raging, that you cannot look out the window or walk outside and detect it. And I said, just because you're freezing your ass off doesn't allow me to say there's no global warming. And just because you got sweat dripping off your ass doesn't mean you get to say there is global warming. I said, if it's real and if it's consequential, the naked eye will not be able to detect any of these parameters. One time I got in an argument with a guy, and he said, I remember back in October, decades ago when it snowed in Ithaca. And I said, yeah, it was October 14th. He goes, yeah, I think you're right. And I said, you know why you remember it? He goes, no, why? And I said, because it was weird. It was strange. It was strange then. It wasn't snowing in October normally. We both remember that day because it was bizarre. So the sea ice doesn't look like it's changing, and it could be, but you don't sit to go, oh my God, you can hear the water rushing out of the Arctic and the Antarctic. Great Guardian headline, why is the sea ice at record levels despite global warming? And so whoever wrote that headline is failing to recognize that maybe there's no global warming. So another headline from another source said that scientists are struggling to understand why Antarctic hasn't warmed for over 70 years despite the rise in CO2. It's like, well, let me help you out here. Maybe the CO2 is not doing it. Let's start with that. Again, another Guardian headline, why is Antarctic ice at record levels despite global warming? Oh, I think that's the same headline. Repeat. Okay. And there's the southern sea ice right there. And it's going up, not down, according to that data set. And again, this one got a lot of headlines back in, I think it was 2 years ago, when someone showed a plot of the Antarctic sea ice, and all of a sudden in 2023, it went just, this is for about, you can see all the years along the side here. It goes from 1979 up to the present. And all of a sudden 2023 fell off the curve completely. And you can imagine the global warmers just going bonkers over that. And I'm sure you remember this. And someone astutely measured it instead of by how much lower it is. They measured it by standard deviations, and what you'll see here is that it's way off the other curves by standard deviations. It turns out it's 6 standard deviations. Now, there's a rule in a lot of fields to say when you measure something that's 6 standard deviations off, it's time to get another model. Because 6 standard deviations, it's 1 in a bazillion, right? I think it's 1 in a billion or something. It's a very rare event. You'll notice several things if you look at this carefully. One is over here. I want to do it with my pen, but I got to remember. Over here, here's 1 year. I don't know what year it is, but here in the month of November, the amount of sea ice was measured to be 6 standard deviations low. How you drop 6 standard deviations and then have it go away in 1 month is really pretty unimaginable. And then it turns out I went fishing for other plots, and I noticed 2 things. One is that in other plots, which I presume, and tell me if you think this is wrong, I presume this is a single source data set, and that there's not other people measuring the same thing from independent sources. I'm guessing this is the guys who study this stuff, right? And yet I noticed that the plots, the fine structure, the little wiggles and jiggles were different. I'd look at the plots, I go, they're not the same plots. In the fine structure, they don't superpose. These, like this little dip might be missing here or something, And then the second thing I noticed is that the 6 standard deviation part disappeared all of a sudden. I go, oh, that got inconvenient. Someone must have noticed that was a fundamental problem. So in any case, that's kind of crap you have to deal with when you're trying to sort through the debris. Now, I argue here that Fat Tony knows the answer. Now, the readers might not know who I'm talking about with Fat Tony. Fat Tony is the guy who Nassim Taleb talks about. And Nassim Taleb tells a narrative where Fat Tony is asked, Tony, if I flip a coin 50 times and it comes up heads 50 times, and then I flip it a 51st time, what is the probability that it's going to come up heads? And Fat Tony says 100%. And they said, no, it's 50%. And Tony says, no, it's 100%. And the person says, why would you say that? And he says, well, the coin was rigged. And the guy said, well, I told you the coin wasn't rigged. I told you the coin wasn't rigged. And Fat Tony said, you lied. All of a sudden you go, that's correct. The easiest way to explain it is somebody lied. So here any of you can see the sea levels rising, and there is a drift there. It's not a big amount of rising. It's certainly, I often ask people what's the biggest consequence of global warming, and they always seem to turn to flooding. If you ever notice that, the flooding is the most common one, and they'll say Florida will become flooded. And I go, and okay, so the Everglades comes back, but it'll take 100 years, according to Al Gore. And Holland has got dikes and stuff and all sorts of things that protect it. And I said, by the way, the coastline, every house in that coastline is going to be gone in 100 years, even if there isn't a rise in sea level, because Mother Nature scrubs them off the coastline. So it seems to be flooding of the coastline is a totally non-event. It will adjust. We have plenty of time. We'll improve our building codes, things like that. And rising the thickness of a dime every year doesn't strike me as horrific. So here's the medieval warming period. This is sea level version. This is the sea level version, and you can see it sort of correlates with the temperature, and you can see the little ice age, and you can see the Middle Ages. Now the PD lately seems to be focusing on the steepness of this part. So let me curves where it's really low, but it's steep, and they worry about that a lot. And I go, okay. I like this one. This one I get from Tony Heller, who I had to get to unblock me from Twitter for reasons I couldn't understand, because I'm a big fan. Tony Heller wears an Ithaca's Gorgeous t-shirt. Do you know why?
No, do
you? He's not a local here, is he? Tell me he's not a local, because if he is, I want to buy him lunch. So the IPCC had said, and you know this, and everyone knows this, if you actually read the IPCC, there's a lot of really truthful statements about how shit is not happening. And yet somehow the narrative comes out that shit is happening. It just makes no sense. So the IPCC says, look, there's little evidence that climate change is correlating with, anthropogenic climate change is correlating with sea level rise. The thing I steal from Tony is, I said, see this part right up here? He says, that's your fault. That's really good. Right here, that's your fault right there. The rest of this is, we're coming out of an ice age. So the sea level rose many, many meters coming out of an ice age. I don't want to be around for the next ice age, so I'm not looking forward to that part. This is the thing that got me. Is it hey-ho? Is that how I pronounce it? I think I showed this before. I think I did a talk with you before and showed this. So hey-ho posted something on, Catherine hey-ho posted something on Twitter, and it was a report that had a bunch of stuff in it, but in it had wildfire damage in the Southwest. And I said to Catherine, this was what got me on the shit list, I think. I said, well, that looks like fraud to me. And she says, well, why would you say that? And I said, well, the first problem is that you never start and do it cumulatively. So if I plotted cancer deaths from 1985, the plot would look like we have a cancer epidemic. But in fact, they add up over time. If I plotted deaths from falling off a tractor, they would go from lower left to upper right, right? And then what bothered me, though, was the wildfires attributed to climate change, and the wildfires attributed not to climate change. Now, immediately I know that distinction is just not makeable. And the problem is you can't separate climate change from land management, right? You just can't separate those two. And so she said, well, you have to read the primary literature. So I went and read the primary literature, and there was this plot. It was more sciencey looking, less colorful. But what they had done is they used, everything was correct except for this axis right here. It wasn't just cumulative forest fire burn. It was modeled cumulative forest fire burn. Now, we both know by definition, it's probably modeled in some way. Well, one could imagine that being measured, but this one said modeled. We also know that the word modeled is toxic to the deniers, because right away it makes it pretty easy to say, well, it's just a damn model. Now everything's a model, but it kind of, so someone decided the word model was just a little inconvenient, so let's take it off, because otherwise there would be no reason to take it off. Now, I put here, this is U.S. forest area burned since 1926, which shows we've really actually gotten it under control. Now, if you go to 1985, you squint down here, this is 1985 right here. See my cursor there? And so if you wanted, you could plot total area burned in the U.S. from 1985 to the present. You would get an upward slope there. And this is plotted by year. So this is at least plotted correctly. But they didn't, they picked that window. They picked this window right here to make this plot right here. And then Catherine blocked me on Twitter. And so we move along. I've lost no sleep over Catherine blocking me. I don't want to get in an argument with the deniers. They can present their shit. I'll present my shit. So that their start points are always convenient as hell. Any idiot can see we have serious drops. This is Lake Mead. Lake Mead was going down pretty steeply. The most interesting story behind the Lake Mead dropping, besides the fact that there are cities around the Southwest, it will not have water when Lake Mead, when the water level goes below the drain inputs, right? But the other interesting thing is they started finding barrels with bodies in them, which apparently the guys in Vegas were dumping their enemies into Lake Mead in barrels. They thought they were safely underwater, and then all of a sudden they started showing up there. Videos of guys finding barrels with carcasses in them. Lake Mead, there's another lake tied to Lake Mead, and it's also dropping, but it's filled up some. But I think probably the Southwest really is going to have a water problem going forward, and I think they're probably draining the hell out of Lake Mead. California turns out to be an interesting case study. The 20th century was the wettest century in the previous 10 centuries. So we basically built the state of California on a desert. And we picked a wet phase to build the state of California. And now we've got a problem. 2 years ago, I actually wrote about how Los Angeles had 350 fire hydrants that were broken. Last year, I got to write about how those 350 fire hydrants helped LA burn to the ground because they weren't working. So California really is a dumpster fire by every imaginable metric. And the most appalling part of California is that there's literally people living in California. It's just astonishing to me. There's people who want to move there, although there's, I think, more who want to leave. In any event, the precipitation hasn't changed much in California. It's land management problems. Now, again, iconic photo on the left, right? The polar bear photo, and Konstantin Kysin made the dire undersupply of polar bears. I think he used that phrase in this talk. But any idiot can see, you got a polar bear on the left. He's obviously a pathetic creature at this point. And I was in the middle of a podcast when it finally clicked. We don't know why that polar bear is dying. And I looked up what do polar bears eat, and the answer really is fundamentally anything they want. So that polar bear could be 40 years old, could have stomach cancer, could be anything. Now, I put it juxtaposed to the grizzly bear on the right, who looks okay, but he looks a little on the scrawny side. That turns out to be bead-nosed bear number 409. He is the reigning champion for fattest bear in Alaska. The picture on the left is in the spring. The picture on the right is in the fall. And as I like to point out, I just duped you, and it was easy, right? I showed you a scrawny grizzly, and you said, oh, yeah, that's horrible. That's so sad. Well, yeah, it's sad that he got so goddamn fat. My wife thinks I look like bead-nosed bear 409 on the right. And then he finally succumbed to a younger bear for the championship. He finally gave it up. Then here's a guy named Dan Nepstad, who supposedly is an Amazon expert, forest expert. And remember, they said the Amazon was a disaster and it's the lungs of the world. And he just said that statement is such utter bullshit. Again, when you ask serious scientists, if they're feeling honest, they tell you the truth. And he's also an author in the IPCC report, so you can dismiss him if you wish, but now it means you've got clowns in the IPCC, which there's some very good people writing for it. The reefs, everyone talks about the reef. My wife always goes to the biology route. So my wife's a biologist. She always talks about the destruction of the biosphere. And I'm sympathetic to that component. And interestingly, here's something I hadn't thought of. When I was listening, I think we talked about this when we were talking about the debate with Steve Keen. I always said, look, if you can't grow corn in Nebraska, you can grow it up in Saskatchewan if the climate gets warm. But someone pointed out to him, and this is an interesting argument. They said, but Saskatchewan it might be the right temperature, but it doesn't have the candle power. And that's one of the only coherent arguments I've heard out of the global climate community that I actually go, okay, so if there is climate change, we try to grow corn up in Saskatchewan, it'll be warm, but not that much brightness to the sun because it's too north. And so that's an interesting argument. The coral reef, it turns out, seems to be recovering, and it cycles. Apparently, goes through unbleached cycles regularly. Cyclone Hamish, the cyclone seems to have a regenerative power, so maybe you kind of scrub the reef of debris, like a recession for the debris, and then it grows back. There's theories that a number of these reefs are being hurt by human intervention, like sunscreen and scuba divers and stuff like that. So I think it was the Caribbean, after one of the bad hurricanes, their tourist season dropped off for a couple of years, and apparently the reef came roaring back without tourists wreaking havoc on the reef. And so the burning of the reef is not terribly valid looking at this point. And here's the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Association saying that the climate deniers are being attacked, and that the IPCC is read like the Bible, and the views are extreme, and it's reached religious levels, and I think he's pretty correct about that. Again, apparently not a credible scientist, though. There's robust evidence that disasters are displacing people worldwide, but there's no evidence that it comes from rising sea level. That's from the IPCC. Here's U.S. hazard losses as percent of U.S. GDP. What's clear is it's not soaring. Again, I don't know what a big year. That must have been a big hurricane year or something, where maybe in 2005 something mowed through up the coast and did a weed whack along the coast. I could look up hurricanes. I bet one hurricane did that 2005 number.
Must have been Katrina, right? 2005 Katrina?
That could have been. Yeah, that could have been. There was one where they lost something like 11 stealth bombers. And what was appalling is that they stored the bombers, which are $1 billion a piece, in a hangar that was not hurricane proof. I go, if I had $11 billion worth of bombers, I think I'd build a building that could withstand a hurricane to protect those, right? So that was human error right there. And so again, IPCC being honest in the half that's honest, and trying to rein in the half that likes to tell a lot of lies. And it's just a general idea about risk. So, we're always going to face risk. Risk isn't about what will happen, but it's about what could happen, right? And so I, for example, prepared for Y2K. I didn't know whether it would happen, but I could assess what would happen if it was a problem. And then ironically, COVID showed up, and I was pretty emotionally ready and pretty prepared for, okay, the stores are not going to supply shit. What do I need? I'd already worked through those details. So I had the toilet paper that others couldn't find. Russian roulette's a statistical 5-to-1 winner, but you wouldn't want to play it. So here's the chance of dying from an extreme weather event. And this is from Schellenberger, another convert. As I think we've talked about before, I know many people have gone from being believers to non-believers. I don't know anyone who's gone the other direction, although I could miss it. It's one of those things that maybe I'm blind to it, but Schellenberger also went from left to right politically. He's had enough of a lot of features of the new woke world. And but he was a famous environmentalist, and he pointed out that that we've gotten really good at not dying, in part because we see them coming, right? The famous Galveston hurricane, the whole island got covered with something like 10 feet of water, so they all drowned. the Cubans apparently tried to tell them, hey, a bad one's coming, and Galveston didn't take them seriously. But now we see them coming. We get people out of there. Once in a while, someone weathers the storm and dies. But, tornadoes show up. Everyone hits their shelters. We know when there's a problem. And therefore, severe weather events are not risky. Here's a plot, 10 times more cold deaths than heat deaths in Europe. So if you can worry about Europe getting too hot, but cold kills people, not heat. Now we get into the silly stuff. Pandemic of kidney stones. Experts say that there's increasing kidney stones among the children, and they say the hospitals are building stone clinics, right? I'm going, oh my God, I just wet myself again. So let's say the temperature has risen 4/10 of a degree. I happen to live on a lake, and if you go 500 yards up the hill, it's easily 4/10 of a degree colder. So am I getting kidney stones because I'm at the lake, whereas the guys who live up the street aren't getting kidney stones? And if I moved to Pennsylvania from New York, would I get more kidney stones? If I moved to Florida, would I just be nothing but a walking kidney stone? And the answer is no. If they are building stone clinics, it's someone who made up a bullshit story to get federal money with an addition on their hospital. Right? And by the way, those beds will be useful for other things besides kidney stone pandemics. And so this is just an absurd statement made by some young punk journalist who didn't know enough to write something sane. Underground climate change. You know what that is? Because I haven't yet figured out what underground climate change is.
No, I don't know.
Deforming the ground beneath building study finds. So apparently you better put in a footer, and then you won't have that problem. My understanding is that the ground changes in Ithaca between summer and winter. So there's deformation between those two seasons. So climate change would be minor compared to those two changes. So again, Morlock habitat destruction, I called it. Here's one from National Geographic. This is one of the funniest stories of them all. They discovered that plants taking in CO2 weren't using as much as they thought, and so they turned it into a narrative that said that the plants are releasing more CO2 than they thought. But I've jumped ahead of myself. Let me back away from that. Keep that thought so I don't have to repeat it. But they're saying that the rising CO2 are making the plants proliferate, and they're sucking the water out of the ground. And I've gone, that's National Geographic, right? This is not Mad Magazine or the Bee, the Babylon Bee or the Onion. This is National Geographic saying the plants are sucking the water out of the ground. Like, oh my God, that's so funny. Oh my God. And then when three scams collide, here's a CDC tweet that says, the best way to fight climate change and support Ukraine is staying up to date on your boosters. It would have been cool if they could have put a fourth one in there. There had to be some way to slip in, Donald Trump or something into that story. Maybe the person who wrote that. One time I showed a funny tweet by an organization. I showed it to my son. He says, "Oh, that's owned by my friend Joe. He wrote that." So here's a picture of Greta and some famous people, including Sanjay Gupta, who's been called out for lying, and some other players. And what's funny about it is, since a panel discussion about coronavirus, so apparently Greta is now an expert on coronavirus too. And as I said to the group in New Orleans when I spoke about climate change, I said I am going to now start giving talks on vaginal itch, because I think I'm equally qualified to talk about that subject. And here's Vladimir Putin giving Greta shit, saying, go explain to countries that living in poverty, they should not pull out of poverty. They should not be like Sweden. And so again, the elite liberal left pushing this narrative are basically asking third world countries to stay impoverished. And that's a funny story. They've gotten rid of Greta. I don't know if you've noticed, Greta's doing no climate change shit now. She just ran out of gas. So that's that. Again, she's off to Gaza now. But the rumor was, and I haven't seen evidence this getting legs either, but a woman named Sophia Chiani of Stanford is being positioned to replace Greta. That was the story. And I'm looking at Sophia going, I can see merits to that replacement. I can spend some time reading about Sophia. Stanford grad, a little more under the hood. So here's AOC said the world's going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. AOC is a world-class nitwit, and Patrick Moore pointed that out, calling her a pompous little twit, noting that you would bring about mass death. Patrick being the founder of Greenpeace, a known right-wing white supremacist organization. The Green New Deal wasn't originally about, this is AOC's handler, by the way. This is an interesting story. This guy, Sekat Chakrabarti, he was her handler. And the minute she got elected, he completely disappeared from the public view. So he somehow put her into the primary. AOC actually, this is an entertaining story. I heard her talk about it. They had a cattle call to primary the pre-existing Democrat in her district. And her brother submitted her name and a resume for her. And she apparently got a phone call, said, we'd like to talk to you. And she was just bartending at the time. But it was a cattle call that made him say, he took one look at her and said, oh, we can work with this girl. That's how they got her. And she described it. She was sitting at a dining room table describing this. So in any event, her handler said it's about the global economy, not about climate change. And he disappeared. And I don't know what happened. Maybe she's MK Ultra product. I don't know. You can always, response to risk. You glue yourself to the road if you wish. That'll certainly help the climate change problem. And I love this meme where the guy says, you thought you had a dog, but it was just a climate change protester, showing great relief. You can cut back on healthcare. Here's an article on Mail Online Health saying that surgeons should cut back on anesthetic because it's causing climate change. And as I said to my class, if someone cuts back on my anesthetic in the OR, and I'm aware of it, their scalpel's going right into their throat when I wake up. There's no chance that this makes any sense whatsoever. And then because of the trees, this idea that the trees are taking more CO2 and therefore they're releasing more CO2 than they thought, but releasing more of it. The trees are a source of CO2. And therefore, again, I can see you smiling. It's so hard to comprehend being this stupid. And therefore, we should cut down the trees. And there were people saying we should cut down something like 100 million trees and bury them, ignoring the fact that they're still going to put out CO2 from degradation. But you say, well, that can't be that. Well, here's a bunch of headlines talking about it. So, more than one news outlet did it. They talked about banning gas stoves because they were causing climate change. And I love this one. This is a meme, but it says this is a 5-year-old's lungs whose parents use a gas stove. Those turn out to be ginger roots, but I thought it was really funny because there were people who thought that was true. They were appalled by how bad the kids' lungs were. Here's urging you to restrict your holidays because of carbon allowances and warn against travel. So they're trying to get us to really behave ourselves now in a serious way. And here, the cows, the cow fart story. Farming needs to stop. Farming needs to stop because it is the biggest driver of climate change. I go, what are you going to eat? Right? Let's start with that. What are you going to eat? I guess we could fish, but I'm sure they'll find a way that causes climate change. But in any event, they talked about killing many, many cows. They did end up killing, the price of eggs soared because of bird flu. They killed 100 million birds, 100 million chickens, apparently. It turns out there were 2 cases of bird flu that supposedly killed someone. What the stories forget to mention is that every year 40,000 people on average die from flu. So the fact that 2 of them were killed by bird flu, it is so extraordinary that they would then kill off 100 million chickens. That either the world is run by completely stupid people, or we are being we're being gaslit, or they're attempting to destroy society. Because the guys running the operation, who made the call to kill 100 million chickens because of 2 bird flu deaths, there's not a simple explanation for that. They'd have to have an IQ of 40 to come to that conclusion. Birth rates in free fall, as 1 in 4 Americans put off having kids due to climate fears. There could be a component of truth in that story, but I think more likely is that they're putting off having kids because they can't afford them, because the economy's all screwed up. So I think there is a population drop, or the population's rolling over. Now, here's the pitch I'll give to people. This is getting a lot of press now. It has nothing to do with climate change. Might be, some people might say the world's such an awful place, I'm not having kids. You probably shouldn't breed either. So you're cleaning the gene pool by taking that stance. But there is that we're below ZPG supposedly, and it's starting to show. Now, you can read Peter Zeihan's data. I wouldn't listen to his opinions because I think he's a total neocon, but his data I think is good. Elon Musk talks about it like it's catastrophic. I don't know why he says that. If you have to replace it, if you have to add new people to the population to pay for the existing players, which is what the argument is, that is a classic Ponzi scheme. You need new entrants. And therefore, it's not sustainable. Ponzi schemes always collapse. So what I would say is let's naturally let the population shrink if that's the direction we're heading. It solves potential pollution problems, resource consumption problems, if you want to pretend climate problems. And there'll be a generation or 2 of economic constraint, because demographics does drive economics at some level. In some sense, the Japanese are ahead of us. They are actually further along that population shrinkage curve. Now, if you look at Japan, you say there's an island, it has no natural resources, and it's got too many people. Seems to me a shrinking population may be a net plus for those guys once they get past the economic pain of not having a growing population that produces stuff. So I think we should just let the population shrink. But these guys think it's due to fear of climate change, whatever. EVs, don't get me started on EVs. I think EVs are they will always be here, but I think the optimum in the curve is going to be hybrids. I don't think that pure EVs are a good idea. What's relevant about hybrids, to the investors who are listening, is that hybrids use more platinum than internal combustion engines. And as a consequence, the price of platinum has been flatter than a pancake. And if we really do start going more and more hybrid, the price of platinum could start to move. And platinum's produced in South Africa, where it's kind of a bit of a failed state, and it's produced in Russia, which is always a source of fun and frolic. And so investors out there, pay attention to platinum. It's not a good bet now because it's been flat for 10 years, but it's not going through a meme phase. So keep your eyes on it. Some smart guys are looking at platinum. So in any event, remember the Michael Moore documentary where he and Jeff Gibbs went to create what was unambiguously going to be a super left-wing movie, because that's Michael Moore. He's just super, super left-wing. And they dug in and created this documentary called Planet of the Humans, and it turned out to totally destroy the alternative energy story completely. And they came to the conclusion it was just a big grift. And they were trying to knock it off YouTube and stuff like that, but the internet never sleeps. And so Planet of the Humans is a good documentary. It talks about the absurdity of the biofuels and things like that. And Moore had this total epiphany where he said, holy shit, we got this all wrong. So making the documentary brought him to clarity. Give up drinking. Apparently, climate change is going to ruin your beer. Again, another journalist who can't think of something smart to say. As the quality of hops and barley goes down or something, wildfires can taint the desired flavor. Wildfires can taint the flavor. You can always elect a new president, and you can see here that according to this metric, CO2, that presidents don't really seem to make a difference. In the event of a tornado, you can cope with the big risk by mowing your lawn. This guy seems to not be having a problem. I'm not sure that isn't Photoshop, but it's still funny. You can do a round of golf if there's a forest fire wreaking havoc. And if you have a hurricane, go surfing. And if there's a flood, do whatever satisfies your urges. These are how we've learned to cope through the years with problems. Analysts, this story right here, I watched the two guys talking about this on CNBC, and one of them's a friend of mine, and I gave him so much shit for this. They were discussing what would happen to markets in the event of an all-out nuclear war. I'm going, you've got to be kidding me, right? So if you haven't done it, an actual good read is Annie Jacobson's Nuclear War. And the point being is that once the first ICBM goes off, her estimate is we've got about 70 to 80 minutes before the entire globe has been destroyed. So if there's thermonuclear war, I don't think your NVIDIA shares are going to make a big difference. $150 trillion climate opportunity. And here's a meme that says 97% of climate scientists all agree that they don't want to be defunded. There's some hate mail. Jerry, the emailer, calling me a whiny doctrinaire little man with libertarian leanings. And I used to get these emails after all my podcasts. He'd email the podcaster saying, why do you invite this guy on? So fortunately, you won't get from Jerry because Jerry seems to have gone into the darkness. But I did like his quotes. They were entertaining. And then here's a journalist from the Atlantic Monthly who gave me credit for doing the best takedown of climate change since Michael Crichton. And so I juxtaposing those two always struck me as an entertaining one. Again, reminder, Konstantin Kaysen, Oxford Union, the funniest, the most interesting climate change talk I've ever seen. Here's Klaus Schwab. He has resigned from his position. He's right out of Dr. Strangelove. He's the guy who wants us to eat bugs and that will own nothing and be happy. Or at least he will. It turns out that we're not free and clear. There's his daughter. The acorn has not fallen far from the tree. She's proposing permanent climate lockdowns. So whether you like it or not, I think that's really, he should not have bred, right? He really should not have had a child. Right up there, George Soros should not have had a kid too. Here's the UN climate chief says we have 2 years to save the planet, and that was in 2024. So next year we're past the fail-safe point. That's good to know. They're getting desperate now. They're getting so hyperbolic that they're you can't tell they're seeing this in the Babylon Bee. And again, a famous quote that the climate change is really a marvelous excuse for worldwide supranational socialism. I'm pretty sure Margaret there was criticizing it. I don't think she was a socialist at heart. I have advised people to start reading up about propaganda and authoritarianism. There's some great books like Edward Bernays' 1926 book entitled Propaganda. There's Matthias Desmet's The Psychology of Totalitarianism and stuff. I think if you want to understand the weird things happening in the world, you have to understand authoritarianism, where it comes from, how propaganda is used. And I have read a lot of books now on this, and we are being gaslit, and climate change is just one of the many topics. And here are some of the books. I forgot I put these in here. So for the readers, you can pause the video and write some of these down. They're all very good. The True Believer really really, the 1953 True Believer, I found, someone recommended it. I found it really profound. It talks about how the true believer is the person who's the foot soldier for the movements, right? So they're the ones who are out there gluing themselves to the highway and stuff like that. They're the true believers. He talks about where mass movements come from and how they're propagated and how they end and things like that. There's a tombstone builder website, and I occasionally put out messages. I build them on the tombstones. It's really right there. It's on the tombstone, actually. And there's my contact information if you wish to send me something to help me understand better what I've talked about. Again, I should remind the reader that I'm just an organic chemist using the internet. I'm a pagan with a noisy sword. And I certainly have some stuff wrong. I could be wrong on either side, but I certainly have some stuff right. And I've reached the point now where it would take quite a bit to convince me that I got this one wrong. It's not going to be some plot produced by some scientist from one place. And that's a real problem, because we now, if you haven't reached the point where credentialed experts are questioned by you, you're not paying attention. There's credential experts lying to us in every event, whether it's Ukraine wars or climate change or pandemics or whatever. Economists, they will tell you to buy right at the top, So, and there was an interesting debate this month about Dave Smith and Douglas, not McGregor, Douglas
Murray, right?
Murray, yeah. Murray, I was just one of his biggest fans about a year ago, and I started to notice an inclination that he had that troubled me, a real sort of neocon flavor to his presentations. And I came down wildly on the side of Dave Smith in that battle. And Murray's been playing catch up ever since. He's been doing interviews, he's gone down the Sam Harris rabbit hole, and where he's now made himself look bad and is struggling to find a way to undo the damage. And he was all smart, but
he was all about trusting the experts. Don't bother your pretty little head by thinking for yourself, wasn't he?
And you don't have he says you have the right to say it, but people should be aware that you don't know what you're talking about. And it was real, and it was in particular the subplot was really Israel. And I've had a gag order on Israel for a couple of years now, where I said, look, I'm not going there. I'm on a campus. I stick my head up. I prairie dog that story. Someone's going to shoot me. Either way, someone's going to shoot me. And I'm slowly but surely working up the courage to take a stance on that story once and for all. And I think at the end of this year, I'm going to do so. But there was a bill that just today apparently has been pulled that said that you could be imprisoned for up to 20 years for opposing Israel. And it was that bad. And I'm going, that's it. I just snapped. I've been having to bite my lip. I've got blood drooling down my chin. And the problem, it's not about the religion. It's not about Jews. It's about Israel, the government. And if you think a government is not lying to you, any government, you're nuts. You're psychotic. And so you have to be able to criticize governments.
So I'm going to have to let you go in a minute here, but I did want to find out what how much blowback you got at Cornell by delivering a version of this. Did you get a lot of blowback or not?
Well, I got the blowback from the chair, who said, I thought you were not going to, you're not going to deviate from chemistry. And I got one kid. Generally, the audience was very receptive. So I think the audience, I drew in about at least as many kids as in the class extra when they bring a friend. And I think it was a very anti-climate change crowd. But there was one kid who walked up to me afterwards and said to me, astonishingly to me, he said, do you really believe what you just said? And I said, yeah, of course. I said, I don't see how I could fake that plot. And he just shrugged and walked away like I was just this disgusting, mindless person.
Okay. But you had a bunch of young folks that were receptive, or they even knew some of this already?
I only detected one person who was unreceptive. And there was definitely that, I got an applause. There was some who really liked the story. There was a lot of laughing because unlike the way I did it to you, where I talked about what I said, I actually just presented it, put a lot more emphasis on morons and idiots and things like that. But yeah, I would say that it was received quite well, all things considered. I think, the woke generation has now been replaced by a new generation. So I heard, for example, that someone said that already, like in the middle schools and the high schools, that transgenderism is now frowned upon by the kids and stuff like that. And that looked like it was pretty deeply embedded. But now it's like, no, you're not cool because you think you're some other gender. You're an idiot, right? That story is now not resonating with kids in the lower grades now. And in part, it's because things change. They just change.
I thought I just read some polling that said that young males like 18 to 21 lean towards Trump on college campuses. I don't know. It sounds crazy.
Could be. I'd be surprised. Yeah. But again, I wrote in 2016 when Trump won, I wrote that one of the things I detected a flicker of, but it would be profound if it's true. And I wrote the evidence that I saw was that the Black community was moving to the right. And boy, if 2024 didn't show that, holy cow, right? That Blacks for Trump. I don't remember Blacks for Romney, right? I don't remember any of that. But Blacks for Trump was a very big presence, and I think somehow, ironically, as I wrote this year, 2024, I said the left somehow pulled off the impossible. They turned Donald J. Trump, into a victim. And it is unimaginable that you could do that. If I had said that a year ago, you say no, but they did with all the court cases and everything. And I think people are going, if they treat him like that, they could treat me like that, right? I think there really was and somehow he convinced the little guy that he had their back. And I don't know if it's true. I actually think it is true. I think he does care about the little guy. There's too many stories of people who said, look, he did this for me. He was the only one to back me when I needed it. And he came to my rescue. And there's a lot of stories out there. I think you saw the Bill Maher talk where he talked about spending 2 hours. Maher said, look, you're not going to like this, but he was a totally reasonable guy. And I really liked it. He's there. There might be the guy in the White House is not crazy. He plays a crazy man on TV. And I think that probably drove the left completely out of their minds. But I have to remind myself of that even because I look at him, I go, he looks kind of crazy today. But Maher said he was amazingly affable and amazingly balanced and grounded. And he just said, I hate to tell you, but that is what it is. And so everything we're getting is a narrative. Everything. I can't stand the fact that you can't believe anything.
Right.
And when I find something that goes against what I think, I go, I don't know how to believe it or not. I don't know how to disarm my own arguments at this point. There's things about Trump I don't like what he's doing, but I could imagine So what I say to my colleagues on Trump, it's a really interesting one because we're living it right now, is you got to wait for about a year. The question is, a year from now, where are we? Because he's playing this unbelievable game of chess. And it looks like he's hip shooting, but he's unbelievable. The woman on Shark Tank said, I've never seen a negotiator with his skills. Never. She said he instinctively spots your weakness and goes right for it. And he gets you. And I've read articles about when he was a developer, same story. Somehow he had this uncanny ability to get what he needed. And so what we're seeing right now is this huge battle of which he is sort of kayfabe. He's like a professional wrestler. That's an Eric Weinstein argument. And we don't know. I do know he's causing havoc inside universities. Shutting down all the funding and stuff is really causing havoc. but he also shooting a shot across the bow saying, wake the fuck up. You guys are a bunch of commie dogs, which we tend to be, not so much in the sciences. And you think you just get all the money and everything, but you don't have to answer to anyone, and you can look down your nose at the common man and think you're above it all. And I think he's sending a message to academia, wake up. Yeah. And it's being received, but everyone's scared to death. As I say, I wrapped up my research program last summer, and like I say to my colleagues, and you guys are wrapping up yours this summer, apparently.
Times are changing. Okay, I do need to let you go, but thank you very much for doing this. Any other last word here on this one before we finish up?
Question everything, right? Everyone's lying if their lips are moving.
Thank you very much. This is fantastic. Excellent presentation. Talk to you soon.
You got it.
Right,
thank you.